about you? I'm Andy, and I like to build stuff from anything I can find, really. So if that's something you fancy, stick around. In this episode, I plan on painting the bot I built for Mark in the previous episode. But before we go any further, I have to say a big thank you to the craftsman. He was very kind and featured my channel in one of his videos, which is just unbelievable. He also featured 4 other awesome channels, so make sure you go and check them all out. I'll leave a link for the video in the description. And thank you, craftsman, I really can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So if you're new to the channel, thanks very much for joining, and I love sharing your projects, so if you have any builds you're working on and want me to show them off in a video, send them in, or just give me a shout on Facebook or Instagram. Which leads me nicely into a build sent in from Stevo. This is Stevo's first attempt at scratch building. You might remember his work in progress pics from a few videos back, but this is the final piece. Really great job, Stevo, nice paint job, nicely done. Alrighty, so Mark has named this guy Benny, so I've got Benny the lid bot all primed up with red oxide primer here, ready for paint. And you'll see if I start to twist some of these beads, you'll see that the spray primer just hasn't quite got the inside of some of these beads. So I'll make sure to twist them first, and that way I'll make sure I'll get a coat of paint on them first. And they're wooden beads, so they will take the paint quite well. They're already sanded and ready to go. And I've got my paints here laid out in my wet palette. Just the sort of usual paints I would use for my rust coat. I've got my burnt umber and raw umber, and it comes in these bags, which is strange enough. But and then my other paints are country maple, some clay, and some khaki tan. And that's going to be all the paint that I'm going to use for my stipple coat or my rust coat. And then I've got my two favourite scruffy brushes, just a large one and a slightly smaller one. So for my first stipple coat, I'm going to start with my darkest brown, which is my raw umber, and I'll use my biggest brush for that just to make it a bit easier for coverage. And like I was saying, making sure to get in those parts of the beads that haven't got hit with paint. But I'll just pop the head off here first, just to make it a bit easier. And I'll just stick this on the end of a felt tip, just so I can hold it. And then put it in here, why not, into my Artiscapade Pro Series Fine Detail Brush Set. Check out my review on those if you haven't already. So now I'll just take my scruffy brush and carefully start dabbing on the paint. Just being careful, I don't want to cover up all of that red oxide. I still want it showing through. But at the same time I want to start building up some texture and some of that rustiness. So I'll just be careful getting it into all those nooks and crevices and making sure I get it full coverage all over. The scruffy brush definitely helps with this, and obviously making sure that you don't overload the brush is very important too. You don't want the brush to be too overloaded, otherwise you'll just get big blobs. So that's the head pretty much done for the raw umber anyway. So now I'll move on to the body, and like I was saying, make sure to get those places that I haven't hit with the undercoat covered. And that's my first layer of stipple coat done. I say it all the time, but you could probably stop at this point now and start into your colour. That would be a good enough sort of rust coat, but I like to add a wee bit more texture just and a wee bit more colour to it. So I'm going to move on to my burnt umber, and I'll use my slightly smaller scruffy brush this time, just to have a wee bit more control, and it's a wee bit finer, So yeah, onto the burnt umber, and I'll start with the head here. And just same again, just carefully go around the whole thing and making sure I cover all the edges and all those wee parts that I know I'm definitely going to be leaving exposed. And that's the head done. And I just do the same again on the body, and then I can start moving on to some brighter colours. Alrighty, that's the body done, and I can move down my palette to the clay, which is kind of a brick orange, So just to change it up a wee bit, instead of using the small scruffy brush, I'm going to use this piece of kitchen sponge. It's just a piece of Mr. Scrubby from the kitchen. I think I'll get some finer sort of stipples from it, as long as I'm careful. So yeah, I'm going to load it up with some of my clay paint, and then just carefully go around and do the same again. And this clay will look quite bright, but I'll be doing some washing with some black wash when I'm finished, so it'll darken it back down again. It's I've found that sometimes the brighter the colours you use in the rust coat, the nicer it turns out. So I'm not afraid anymore just to use some nice bright oranges or reds in my rust coat now. And you can see, yeah, the sponge has worked really well. It has made some real nice variation in some of the patterns and just made it nice and random. It was a wee bit hard to get into some of the sort of nooks and crannies, but if you use the sharp edge on the sponge, it makes it a bit easier. So yeah, just continue that all over the body to get something like this, looking really good. And like I've said before, you could just stop at this stage and start adding your final colour coat, but I'm going to keep going with a sponge and just continue to move down my palette to the country maple and the khaki tan and end up with something like this. And if I wanted to, I could just give this a few coats now of brown and some black wash, and it would just tie it all together nicely, and that would just be a perfect rusty, neglected robot. But for this guy, I just want parts of this rust poking out in places, so I'll probably end up covering 90% of this up. So for my final colour, I'm going to go for some blue. I don't really paint much with blue, so I thought I'd make a change. I've got the sky blue here and the cyan blue, so I'm going to use the sky blue like an undercoat. I've just put it out on some parchment paper and added a few drips of water, just to water it down a wee bit. And I'm going to use my Artiscapade flat number 1. You wouldn't want to be using a good brush for doing a stipple coat with. It would just ruin the brush. Keep your old brushes for the stipple coat and the good brushes for this sort of job. And usual procedure, I'm just going to paint up to the edge or the edges and leave some of this rust exposed. Sometimes I would leave like random patches of wear here and there, but for this guy's head I'm gonna fill this whole lot in. And the idea behind putting this lighter blue undercoat on first is that when I paint over this with my darker cyan blue, I'll leave some of this light blue exposed. To me that kind of gives like a weathered look on the paint, or like the paint's been sort of sun bleached over time. The edge of the lid has these ridges on them, so I've took a slightly smaller flat brush and I'm going to carefully go around and just paint in between these ridges. I'm going to try my best to leave the high points with rust on them, or leave that rust exposed on the high points. It's a harder job than it sounds, but I'm going to do my best. To me it just makes sense that the high points are going to get the paint worn off them first, so that's generally where I aim to leave the rust parts exposed. So that's the blue undercoat done on the head, and I can move on and do the body. So I'll pop that back in my Artiscapade tub, just so it doesn't roll about. And then I'll just continue to do the same thing for the undercoat on the body. And I'm just trying to keep in mind anywhere that might get some extra wear and tear, try to leave that rust exposed. Alrighty, that's my undercoat done. I can move on now to my dark blue, or my cyan blue. And pretty much the same rules apply here. I'll just take my darker blue and paint up to the edge of that lighter blue, making sure that I leave the edge of the lighter blue exposed. And like I was saying, that gives that sort of sun bleached look, or that like the paint is worn off over time. This would definitely be one of the easier steps, because you've already got that light blue undercoat to use as a guide for your darker blue. So that's the head done, and I'm really happy with it. I think the blue looks lovely, and I just move on now and do the rest on the legs and on the body, and then I'll be ready to do some highlights. So yeah, I'm really happy with this blue. I'll definitely be painting with this blue a wee bit more, but I think just to make it pop, I'll add some red highlights. So I have this crimson red, nice dark red. Same again, I'll put a wee bit out on my parchment paper and put a few drips of water on it. And I'm just going to do around his eyes here, just to make them stand out a wee bit more, and then do the guitar string here on his head. It's just a wee bit of guitar string that I bent and stuck into his head. And yeah, to me that just makes him pop a wee bit more. And then I just go around the legs and the body and do the same again. Just pick out a few places to highlight with the red. And then after a coat with the crimson, I came back with some scarlet red, which is just a slightly brighter red. And I kind of did the opposite to the undercoat for the blue. Instead of a light undercoat and a dark top coat, I did the opposite, and I think it looks pretty good. So yeah, you can see just a few wee highlights here and there on his hips and on his ankles kind of thing, just to make him stand out a wee bit more. And then the same idea on the fingers here, just to make them pop that wee bit more. And I think the red goes really well with the blue. But before I add some wash, I just want to do one more detail with some of this worn penny metallic, just on the panel on his face here. It looks pretty good rusted up, but I think it would look even better just done in the metallic. So I've just given it a couple of coats of that worn penny, and it did left the edges again exposed, not too much, but I just thought I'd like this faceplate just to stand out a wee bit more. And that's about him, ready for some black wash. I'm just going to take some black wash and just pick out some details here and there. I would normally just plaster it all over the place, but I'm going to try a wee bit more selective this time. So before I do that, it will be a good time to thank all my Patreon supporters. A big thank you to David, Wes, Luke, Matt, Alice, Cavo, Maggie, Barry, the Craftsman, Cooper, Matt, Sean, and last but not least, Jackson. Thanks everyone for all your support. I really do appreciate it. And just to show you what I got with this month's subscription, I got some more primer and a tin of matte black spray paint and a 3-pack of glue and just some other building materials. So thanks very much guys, like I said, I really appreciate it. Now onto some wash. I've just got some pre-mixed here, just a wee bit of dish soap and some water and some black paint. And I've got my 0 size round brush here. It holds a load of wash, so I'm using it for putting the wash on. And like I was saying, I'm just going to be careful this time. I'm just going to try to add it in some select places. Just carefully add it along this seam and let it kind of drip down those ridges and then around his face. But yeah, normal procedure for me and wash is just plaster the whole thing and then just sort of dab it off with a bit of kitchen roll. But this time, just because it's my first commission build, and I want to try to make it at least a wee bit professional looking. So I do the same on the legs and on the body, just a wee bit of wash here and there on some of the seams and some of the joints, and then leave it overnight to dry. And then the next day, give it a few coats of clear lacquer, and this is it after the clear lacquer has fully dried. So now I'm just going to get him put back together and get him ready for his glamour shots, and then I can get him posted off to Mark. This has definitely been a fun build. I've learned a lot. So next video I'm going to focus on a couple of mech walkers and try to make them movable. So until then, as always, thanks for watching and I hope this was helpful. Any questions or comments, you just know where to go there, down below, work away. And remember, there are no stupid questions here. So here's some glamour shots and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!